Hey y'all, I'm Emily, an almost lifelong quilter with a lot of stories to tell. I have loved quilts and talking about them for as long as I can remember, and I'm here to celebrate the tradition of quilting with you. From family heirlooms to thrift store finds, every quilt holds a piece of history and a little piece of a quilter's heart. Join me every other week to get back to your quilting roots. We'll celebrate quilts and the real people who made them, learn a little bit about the history of quilting, and have lots of fun exploring ways to reclaim tradition in a modern world. I'm so glad you're joining me this week here at Patchwork Revival. Hey there, Patchwork friends. It has been a while since the last episode of Patchwork Revival, and that's because I've been living a lot of life. I've been in the middle of a move. I'm just adjusting to that and have been wildly busy. But launching this podcast has been a great experience for me. I'm so thankful for the support and the feedback I've gotten from listeners. So just thanks for being here. I feel like I just need to say that. Today is an exciting episode because it features my very first guest. This episode features my friend Bree Horde, also known as Bree.inbloom on Instagram. She is a local creative I am lucky enough to call my friend. Bree has a contagious love of thrifting fabric, quilt tops, finished quilts, and lots of other crafty supplies that she incorporates into her creative practice. In fact, since we recorded our episode, Bree opened a studio at our local creative collective, the Chicken Farm Art Center in San Angelo, where she offers introductory sewing lessons, sells reclaimed vintage fabrics, and is full of the best ideas to make learning to sew accessible and fun. Check out at In Bloom Sewing Studio on Instagram for more information. Now, without further ado, let's dive into a conversation about quilting connections, past and present, talk some tips on thrifting for fabric, and imagine the quilting legacy we're building. Thanks for checking out the Patchwork Revival podcast. As a small way to say thank you, I am offering a discount in my pattern shop especially for you. Head over to the link in the show notes to find my shop and enter code REVIVAL for 15% off your purchase. You'll also find a link to Fat Quarter Shop, my go-to online fabric and notions retailer. By using this link, a portion of any purchase you make will help support the making of future episodes. Thanks for supporting the Patchwork Revival podcast. Hi, Bree.
Hi.
Thanks for coming to be with me. I'm going to give an introduction on how I met Bree. So I found Bree actually on Instagram. I was scrolling around and I found you because you had posted a picture of a cute little bat stuffy that you were making.
Yes.
And then I noticed that you were from San Angelo, my hometown.
Yes, I'm a local.
Yes. And that's why you're here. You get to come to the studio, which I think is really cool.
Yes. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you're here.
I'm thrilled.
Yeah. So then I found out that you quilted. And I was like, what? Someone local who is young and hip, like me, obviously,
Yes.
who quilts. That's so cool. So I reached out. Well, I followed you secretly for a long time. And then I reached out because we had a photo shoot that I asked you to help me with. And she agreed. I was shocked because I feel like that's such a creepy thing.
Just someone on the internet reached out to me, come hang out, come model. I don't know who you are, but let's be friends.
Yeah. Here's some quilt t-shirts. Could you please come let me take photos of you in it?
Yeah.
And fun fact, Bree, you were the first person who saw my very first home heart quilt
Remember
top.
that? Yes.
And I was so nervous to show it to anyone because I had dreamed up the design and I just made my little quilt and then I wanted to take pictures of it and you were there and I was like embarrassed. And
it was beautiful.
Nervous,
I was so amazed.
Yeah. So then we have been kind of keeping up with each other. We have a quilt club in town that we go to meetings and occasionally we'll see each other there. We hit the opportunity table a lot together when we're there.
Yes, we love free fabric, vintage fabric, usually.
Yes, free fabric and vintage fabric. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, is to talk about your quilting journey. But what I love about your quilting practice is how you are edgy and modern and cool, but you love vintage. And I think that's such a cool juxtaposition. As we know, I love all things traditional and kind of vintage aesthetic. And so I feel like you do such a great job of marrying those two things.
Oh,
So I
thank
wanted
you.
to talk about that. So to get started, we'll do an icebreaker.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Would you mind to tell us sort of your quilting origin? How did you find quilting? How did you get started?
Okay, so I don't know anyone who quilts prior to meeting you. I had never seen a quilt in person. No one in my family sews with a machine, none of that. And so one day I had came across a beginner sewing class that was being hosted at our local library by a third party. And I'm always looking for ways to bond with my children, and it's usually through arts and crafts. And so I signed up my 10-year-old at the time to go with me. And we went to this sewing class, and he was not thrilled. He was so mad that I drug him along to this sewing class.
Yeah,
But we went, and it was fun. He had a great time. He was like, hey, yeah, thanks for bringing me or whatever. And we still have the little aprons that we made. They are terrible. They are not cute at all.
Did they provide fabric and equipment and supplies for y'all?
They did. So they had, it was probably about maybe like 15 machines there. And they gave us a quick little rundown, like, you know, it's all ready to go. You put your foot on the pedal. That was about it. There's a hand wheel and turn it towards you.
Yeah.
It was very, very simple. And
Which
it's kind of
actually-
scary.
Yeah, but
honestly.
actually sewing is simple. You know?
It is. It's
I
a
mean,
skill that I truly believe anyone can learn if
Me
they put in the,
too.
the time and the effort.
I love that.
So she already had the fabric cut and ready to go, and like a ribbon for the waist tie. And all we did was sew some straight lines. They were terrible. They were not straight. They were not. They looked. It was a great time. We went home with some aprons. He was happy. He was like, "Hey, thanks for bringing me." That was it.
That's so sweet.
And so while I was there, I was texting my husband, "Oh, like we're having a good time, whatever." Well, we get home and my husband was like, "Oh, well, I ordered you a sewing machine." Just surprised me with one. I was
Nice.
like, "What? Okay, well, thanks, I guess." Well, then weeks go by, the sewing machine never shows up. It just got lost in the mail somehow. And
Okay.
so here I am, just, I was expecting a machine, so and it never came in. So I did my own research, ended up getting my own machine, taught myself how to sew.
Do you remember what it was? What machine did you buy?
It was a Singer heavy duty, and it was not a good time. I had so much trouble with it.
Are those the gray?
They are the gray
Gray
ones.
ones? Okay.
You see them everywhere, all over Instagram and YouTube. Everyone's sewing with them. I really struggled with mine. Here I was with a sewing machine. I had no prior experience. So I'm at home trying to teach myself and just getting frustrated, not having a good time. And then one day my mother-in-law comes over and she sees that I'm sewing. And she's like, "Hey, I have this sewing machine in the garage. I never used it. It's been there for 30 years. I'm going to bring it to you." And so she
Okay.
brought it over, and turns out it was a Bernina 1130 from the 80s.
All
And
right.
so I was too afraid to even touch it. I was still struggling with my Singer. So I took that Bernina to our local quilt shop and had it serviced. It was there for a while. Brought it back home, still didn't touch it for like 6 months. And then one day I was just so frustrated with my Singer that I pulled out this Bernina, and it literally feels like it changed my life and changed my sewing game. It just upped it by like 1,000.
Yeah, you leveled up.
It has a needle down feature, and you can also adjust the speed. And having those two resources on my machine really made a huge difference. And just from that point on, it really feel like it changed the sewing game for me. And I fell in love. And
Yeah, it's like you got to have the equipment. Like you can do stuff with what you have, but when you have good equipment, it does make a difference.
it does. And my advice today to anyone who wants to start sewing is to really, find a dealer in your town. Go find the local sewing shop or the local quilt shop and see what machines they are selling, and buy the best one there that you can afford.
Yeah. Also important to know that most places that sell machines will service them, and you do have to service your stuff.
You
I
do.
mean, for sure. We live in a small town. We have a lot of resources, but I have taken my machine to get serviced by someone who just sort of does it out of their home. And it was great. It was fine. But like my automatic needle threader feature got kind of like snapped off, like a little piece of it broke off. And I was
Oh,
really sad about it.
no.
So I agree with that advice. I think that's wonderful advice to share with
They will
people.
also give you a rundown on the machine. I believe most of them will have a master class that comes with your machine. So you'll take your machine home, try to figure it out on your own. Once you have kind of an idea of what's going on, call the shop back up. You'll take your machine back, and then they will give you a rundown of the machine. So I think that's really helpful. So after that, I guess we'll jump back to my sewing story. I just kept seeing all of these quilty Instagram pages, and I loved all of them. I wanted to know more. And so I signed up for a quilting class at our local quilt shop, Quilting Quarters. And I think it was like a 5 or 6 week class. We'd go every Monday for maybe like 2 or 3 hours.
Do you remember how many people were in it?
I think it started with maybe 6. And then when we finished, there was probably 3 of us that actually finished.
The strong survive.
Yes. And this was the quilt top.
Yeah. So Bree, did y'all make the top and quilt it?
So they taught us how to cut fabric with a rotary cutter and an acrylic ruler. And they taught us how to press your fabric, how to match up your seams, all of that good stuff. And so we'd go to class, and each day would be just like a little segment of the quilt top. But we would do most of our work at home alone.
Okay. So it was like tutorials,
Kind
sort
of,
of,
sort
in
of,
person.
in
And
person.
then you'd go home and...
Yes. And so we didn't see anyone quilt in class. So once I got home and I had a finished quilt top and I was getting it all ready, I realized that I didn't set my stitch length to the correct length. And so I kind of feel like maybe I had more questions than answers by the time I was at home trying to figure it all out on my own.
But somehow you did.
I did. I
Because
figured
it
it
looks
out.
great.
I love it.
It's very cute.
I had no idea how to pick out fabrics, what I was looking at, how it was very difficult.
It's intimidating.
It is intimidating.
For sure. And, you know, everybody comes to quilting in a different way. And a lot of people are like, oh, the power of YouTube, you can learn anything. But I do think quilting is something that is best when it's community based, even if it's just you and one other person.
Yes.
To show you, well, this is how I do it, or whatever.
Yes.
No, what do you think?
I agree. It's been pretty hard trying to figure out everything on my own. Like I said, I once I finished that class, I still had to figure out how to bind it. They showed us real quick how to bind, but it's not until you're actually doing it that you're learning. And we didn't do it in class. We had to do it at home. And so I still, honestly, I still kind of struggle with binding, but I get it done. I figure it out.
Yeah, I think everybody does. And that's the thing. Like, who cares? It's your quilt. Just do it the way you
finish
do.
it.
And every quilt, you get better, right? I learned to quilt from my grandmother, and her biggest thing was like, oh, well, you just have to practice. So nothing's going to be perfect, but
Yes,
maybe
I strive for finished over
Yeah.
perfection.
100%. And like maybe one day when I'm 100 or however old I live, I might have one perfect quilt in my life, but I doubt it.
Right.
I doubt it. So, Singer heavy duty. Then you had your vintage Bernina. Do you
Yes.
still sew on it?
Yes, it is set up right now. I have a what is it? I have a vinyl foot set up on it right now. Vinyl attachments. So that's my bag making machine.
Okay.
It is tough. It can sew through very thick, multiple layers with no problem, no skipped stitches. It's great. I don't even have to adjust the tension. It's perfect. It's a beast. It probably weighs like 50 pounds.
Okay.
It's a solid metal machine.
That's so cool. And so that is your mother-in-law's machine.
It is her machine. She never learned how to sew on it.
Okay. Do you know how she got it?
I believe she wanted to learn how to sew at one time.
Yeah.
And so my father-in-law was like, okay, let's get you a sewing machine. And so they went, and he was like, I want the best one for her.
Yeah.
And so I guess that was the best one at the time.
So she got that, and then
I guess she didn't really
Life
have time.
happened.
Life happened. She didn't really have time.
yeah.
And it is intimidating. You really have to want it
Yeah, to learn.
to learn.
And in the 80s, I mean, it's not like you could just pop on the internet
Exactly.
and Google how to
Right.
thread this machine or something. So what do you quilt on now?
Okay, so I quilt on oh my gosh,
It's a Bernina.
it's a Bernina 770 QE
Yeah.
plus. It's
It sounds very fancy.
It is so fancy, and I cannot believe that I even have this machine. I feel so lucky and blessed. It is a dream. I'm currently quilting my daughter's birthday quilt on it, and it's the easiest thing I've ever done. Just some echoed curved lines, and I have a 10-inch throat space, and it's amazing.
It's very luxurious.
Very
It
luxurious.
Sounds so good. Okay.
It's awesome.
So you came to quilting kind of after your introductory sewing class. Do you have a favorite quilt?
They're all my favorite. They're all my babies. My favorite, of course, is the one I'm working on right now.
Yeah.
I did not bring it, but I made the scout quilts back here. Mm-hmm. That one I made for myself.
We don't make quilts for ourselves enough. We'll take pictures of it after the show and we'll put it in the show notes so that everyone can see how beautiful it is. It's green, black, gray. It's beautiful. I love it. It's muted but bold. I really like it.
When I showed that one off at our local quilt club, and after the meeting, everyone was like, "Y'all are the modern quilters." You were the one who made the modern quilt, right?
Yes. Bree and I are of a different vintage than the rest of our quilt club. We are, I would say, the two of us could maybe be described as contemporary quilters. Like my style, I do not think of as modern quilting, but I think because we are younger, not in a good or bad way, we just are. We're millennials and we're the only two there. And so we have been labeled the modern quilters in our quilt club. So
The youngest by what, like 20 or 30 years?
I think so. And I'm really excited actually about our quilt club because my plan is to have some of them come be podcast
That's going to be fun.
guests. Because I think preserving our personal histories is really, really, really important.
It is.
Not just for our families, not just for other people out there, but just because we can do it. And, you know, I've lost my grandmother now, and I have all this knowledge that she gave me, and I would love to be able to share it specifically with my children, and then so that they would know and be able to share with their children, kind of as like a tradition, as
your heritage of quilting and sewing.
Yeah, it's part of who you are, even if you don't sew or quilt, because this is a spoiler alert, but I'm just going to bring it in. Like Bree brought this quilt that's sitting above her and behind her, and it is a quilt that her husband's grandmother made. Great-grandmother. So he didn't really know about it as a quilt, but now he has a piece of his great-grandparents in his home. And that's pretty amazing.
It is amazing.
No. So I'm planning to do a whole episode about labeling quilts. And as I've been thinking through it, I think I'm going to go back and label some old quilts that I have.
Yes.
Not necessarily that I made, but that I know something about.
You know the information about it. Yes, it definitely needs that.
I think yours does too. Maybe we should make a pact. We will label our old quilts with the information we know and we have about them. So one thing that I feel like is very in vogue right now or popular is to sew your stash or reclaim fabric or use vintage or thrifted materials. And I feel like you're really good at that, Brie.
Yes, I am very resourceful. I love thrifting. Always been a thrifter. Mm-hmm. I was shopping at thrift stores in high school out of necessity, before it was cool. But it was also kind of cool back then too.
Yeah.
But also I was kind of poor. So like I was just shopping there because it's what I could afford. Mm-hmm. And I had a great grandmother who was very resourceful. She would repurpose everything in her home. Lots of like religious art. She would decorate it with just items around the home. It was crazy art. So I think I just learned how to upcycle from her. just watching her make cool art. And so now when I'm out thrifting, the first thing I do is go to the linen departments and see what fabric I can find there out of whatever, curtains or bed sheets. Usually the fabric at the thrift store is rolled up and taped or like saran wrapped. So I try to give it a good once over because I can't tell you how many times I've gotten home and the fabric is just not it. It's stained or holey or just unusable. Most of my best vintage fabric has come from estate sales.
Okay.
They are abundant here in West Texas, and I don't know if it's just they're aging out of the women who used to sew back in the day, and they can't anymore. But I've gone to some really good ones here in town.
Yeah. So estate sales are a great place to look for things. Thrift stores, maybe not so much for.
Not so much unless you're willing to risk buying some fabric and going home and being maybe a little disappointed in what you picked out, which is fine. You can find ways to repurpose that, or you can just donate it back to the thrift.
Yeah, that's true. Good point. Because sometimes you just don't need another thing piling up.
Exactly.
So, do you ever thrift notions?
Yes, I
Stuff like
love vintage notions, collectible vintage notions. But usable notions, we have a thrift store called the Sewing Cottage,
Yeah.
and they sell fabric and notions, patterns.
This place is actually really cool. And I don't know how common they are, but it's basically an auxiliary group. So it's like volunteer women
Yes.
at a local retirement community. And they accept donations from all around town of anything sewing related, fabric, like really, really nice quilting fabric, or they have garment fabric. I mean, they have linen, everything.
Everything. I've seen some really nice quilting hoops there, tabletop types of hoops, the floor standing hoops that you would use to, hand quilt.
Thread cones,
Yes.
and they look relatively new. I have an issue with like old thread or using old thread because I have a lot of it that I got from my great grandmother, and some of it is a little bit like desiccated and dried
Yes,
out.
brittle. I will thrift thread if I give it a really good, once over. It has to be, sometimes I'll find thread that's still wrapped in plastic.
Yeah.
And so I'll buy that then, and especially if it's a brand that I use. But I've also found some really good cotton thread that I can just tell by looking at it. It's not very old, and I'll buy it at that point.
Yeah. And then do you use it in your machine?
Yes.
Yeah. Because that's my thing is I don't want to like have it broken off in my machine and I'm not able to get it out, or it's like leaving a bunch of residue or stuff in there. So I actually, when I based my quilts, some of them I will thread baste like my grandmother used
That's
to.
right, yeah.
And so using some of those old threads for that is good
Mm-hmm.
because it's temporary. You're going to rip it out anyway. It doesn't have to be perfect. So that's how I figured out how to use them. But.
Right. So I wouldn't recommend thrifting thread unless you know what you're looking at and what you're looking for.
Maybe that's advanced.
Yes. But totally thrift your fabric. Some of my best fabric has come from the thrift store. I was out of town one time at a Salvation Army, and I found a big, those comforter bags? They're plastic. Mm-hmm. I found one of those bags full of fabric, and the bag, of course, was taped up. But I could see in there might be some gems. And it was half off day. So I was like, I'm going to pay $3. It was a 15-pound bag of fabric. Like, it was heavy.
Yeah.
It was packed in there. And so there was a few good pieces of fabric in there. But what I found 2 feed sack fabric, whole cloth. They hadn't been cut or anything. I found 2 feed sacks in there.
Holy moly.
And this $3 bag of fabric.
Yeah.
So that was pretty awesome.
Do you remember what they looked like? Can you describe them?
I should have brought them. They're gorgeous. So one of them's like a minty green and red.
Uh-huh.
And they all have, dainty little flowers.
Which is your favorite?
Which is my favorite. I love vintage florals. Calicos, are they called calicos?
I think so. We should actually look this up because when I think of a calico, I picture like cotton with little like ditzy florals on it.
Yes.
Or a print.
I watch a lot of Little House on the Prairie. I love that show. But in that show, Laura's always like, oh, let me go get my calicos. And it's usually like her little floral
It's her,
dress
yeah,
or something.
exactly. You know, it's funny that you say that because I did not really watch Little House on the Prairie so much, but reading Little House on the Prairie as a kid, I swear was part of the reason I asked my grandma to teach me how to quilt because I was obsessed
Yes.
with Laura Ingalls Wilder. I wanted to be her. I wanted to live in a little house in the big woods
Hmm.
and do patchwork. And
Yes.
I love that. It's a connection for sure.
That's awesome. If you go back and rewatch the show now, there are so many quilts throughout the show. It's crazy.
I actually follow someone on Instagram. I know social media, but she was asked by someone, you know, she has a connection to someone who asked her to recreate some of the quilts that were
Oh,
in that
wow.
show, which another point, have you ever seen The Proposal with Sandra Bullock and
No.
Ryan Reynolds? Okay, well, there's a old like a vintage quilt in there called well, Betty White is the grandmother and she calls it the baby maker quilt.
Oh my
And
gosh.
it's like an old pineapple quilt, you know, the block that
Hmm.
a lot of, I think it would probably be easiest to do paper piecing for it. And it is like, I will pause the movie simply to look at the quilt. But I found someone who made a pattern of it, and I really want to put that on my list,
Oh,
on my
wow.
to make list.
Yeah.
I want to go back to thrifting because my hope is that we can make maybe a little sheet or something for people to have tips for thrifting when
Yes.
you're using thrifted fabrics.
Yes.
One thing that I feel like people might get hung up on, and I used to, is because I have a lot of fabric from my grandmother. I just haven't been able to bear to get rid of it or part with it. So I have it all. And some of it is maybe not my style,
Hmm.
but some of it that I think is not my style, I've actually been able to incorporate with other, I would say, more modern or contemporary color palettes or fabrics. I love to sew with wovens and linens and things. And so when you are thrifting fabric, do you just see what you like, see what they have, or do you ever have a project in mind? Number one. And then when you make a project with your thrifted fabrics, are you typically using all vintage fabrics or are you kind of mix and matching them?
Okay. So here lately, I just use a lot of new modern fabrics, but I do have a very large vintage fabric collection.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm out shopping and I see a fabric that I think will be cohesive with my other vintage fabrics, I will buy it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I'll see yardage of vintage fabric and I'm like, oh, I can make a dress out of that. So I buy it.
Yeah.
So I can see, I don't usually go with a project in mind, but I'll find a fabric and instantly I know what I can use it for. So I'll grab it at that point.
If you have a plan.
If there's a fabric I like and I can imagine a project with it, I'm gonna grab it.
Yeah.
But most of the time I go and I do not have a project in mind.
You're sort of limited to what they have. So,
Yes.
yeah.
And so since I've been quilting, I guess about a year now, if I see a cotton fabric that there's yardage of and that I know, I really love this color and I can see this in a quilt down the line, I will grab it.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the past year, I've been collecting thrifted quilting cotton. And I just cut up a huge stack of gorgeous blues and this like terracotta red orange fabric. And I'm about to start a quilt using all thrifted materials. And I am so excited. And this was
Ooh.
me collecting fabric for a year
Yeah.
that I knew, hey, this blue kind of looks similar to the blue at home. So I'm going to grab it. So I would just suggest if you're out thrifting and you see a fabric that you love and it's in your price range, grab it. If you can spend the few dollars that it's going to cost you to buy this fabric, buy it. You might end up using it. You might not. You might donate it back to the thrift or give it to someone else who wants to sew or is learning to sew, something like that.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I think that there's something special about vintage fabric because you can almost picture the life it had before or like imagine
Yes,
it.
it feels so special.
It does.
Is that just us, though?
I don't know.
I don't
It
know if
might
anyone
be.
else would feel that way.
It could just be us, but I don't think so because I feel like people who use fabric and make quilts out of fabric, specifically, that's who we're talking to, but really anything out of fabric that you hold and you make, there's some weird sentimental tie that it
Yes.
has with you. So,
That's how I feel when I'm at an estate sale and I see the sewing room and all of their unfinished projects or those quilt blocks or the quilts that are being sold. I'm like, I love all of this.
I know.
I will buy this fabric and I will do something with it, and it is going to be loved with me at my home.
I know, which is important. So, when you buy your fabric, do you pre wash? Does it just depend? Do you care?
It depends. So if I'm buying thrifted fabric and it looks dirty, has a funky smell, it's getting washed.
Fair
Most of the
point.
time, it does not. If I'm buying fabric from the store brand new, I do not wash it.
Oh, I don't either. I don't have time for that.
But thrifted, generally, no, unless it smells or looks dirty.
Yeah. So, one experience I have had with using, I would call it vintage fabric, but it came from my grandmother's stash. And okay, listen, I don't know where she got this fabric. It could have been Walmart. She bought a lot of her stuff from Walmart because she lived in the sticks of East Texas. Like, that's what she had. And she was very frugal. So, I used a cranberry colored, like very saturated red in a project.
Yes.
And I just wasn't thinking. I mean, I'd been sewing, like quilting for forever, so I knew better. But I was like, I'm in a hurry. Well, my whole quilt that I finished came out kind of pink.
Oh, no. It bled.
It bled everywhere. And I knew better, and I wasn't heartbroken because, whatever. It was fine. But it kind of sucked. So I would say maybe depending on the color, but particularly with red or like burgundy, like maybe purple, I could imagine
Yes.
doing that. Maybe just a little
extra-
soak, some pre-wash.
Okay, pre-wash, extra color catchers.
Yeah, a lot of color catchers.
I was wondering about the terracotta red orange that I'm about to sew with, if that was going to bleed.
Well, and I don't know. I'm sure it also has to do with the, like, moda from the 1990s is probably a lot different than, I don't know what brand from Walmart in the 1990s. I would imagine. But I'm not sure because I'm not that well versed in like dyeing practices
Right.
or the science behind fabric dyes and things like that, if I'm just being fully transparent. So,
I haven't had a quilt bleed yet or colors run. The red on this 70-year-old quilt, it bled. You turn the quilt around and there's red spots everywhere.
yeah. But also, like, whatever. Still use it. It's beautiful. I love that quilt so much. I can't wait to show it off in those show notes that we're gonna. So to recap, we're gonna talk. I think I'm gonna make. Actually, I know. I am gonna make a little freebie download with thrifting tips.
Yes.
Some like crowdsourced stuff that me and Brie have come up with. I do want to talk about the smell of a vintage fabric.
It's very distinct.
It is.
I love it.
I do too. And I get it when I'm ironing it.
Yes.
I use Faultless when I'm pressing my blocks and stuff. I'm going to tell you now, I do not starch my fabrics before I cut. I just get in there and go wild. Do you?
Not usually, unless there's a hard crease in the fabric. That's the only time I starch.
Yeah. So I'll be cutting it, put it in my project, then I press my little block and I'm like, yep, that's one of my mama's fabrics in there.
I love that. Yes, fabric from the thrift has a very distinct smell. It doesn't even have to be from the thrift, estate sale fabric.
I think it's an age. I think it's an age thing.
No, I don't know what it is. It's a little dusty.
It's a little dusty, a little chemically.
Yes.
It's kind of sharp, but not dirty. I don't know what it is.
I don't know what it is, but I love it.
It's if you know, you know.
Exactly. I feel like when you walk into the sewing cottage, that is exactly what it smells like in there.
Man, that place, it's like a little piece of, for me, heaven on earth.
Oh my gosh, I love it in there. I just took my kids recently. And they were like, "Where have you been?" I'm like, oh, I don't know. I tried not to come so often.
Yeah, because you can't walk out without something. There's always something really good in there.
really good. I just went last week and I left with 4.5 yards of the most gorgeous baby blue fabric, and it has of course, little dainty florals. It's
Your
gonna be a perfect
favorite.
backing.
So last time I went, I got like 4 yards, maybe 5, of a brown gingham.
That is so you.
I know. When I thrift fabric or go to like a resale or an estate sale, I have quilted long enough now that I know I'm not a big fat quarter quilter. I'm not a big charm pack quilter. I do like mismatched, scrappy, wonderful things, but I like to test patterns. For my friends, I do make my own patterns. Like I don't just haul off and I'm like, oh, I'm feeling like making some patchwork. I'll make a little 9 patch. Like I just don't do that. And so what I typically find that I reach for in my fabric stash is yardage. So I have gotten to be a little bit more discerning about knowing what I like to use. And so I'll pick up usually at least a yard. Like what do you usually pick up?
That's a tough one. If I'm out shopping at, like a quilt store, not thrifting, I grab a yard.
At least.
And then when you're thrifting, you just never know.
I know. If I really, really like it, I'm like, yeah, I'm just gonna get that. Like I found a little fat quarter last time I was at the sewing cottage it's yellow. This sounds so silly to describe. It's a yellow background with little like geese, like mother goose.
No, you
She's
did
very
not.
small, like half an inch,
I
with
love that.
a blue bonnet and like a blue umbrella or something.
Yes,
Like
I love that.
I wasn't just gonna leave that there.
No.
And someday I will use it.
Yes.
But I had to buy that. And then, I look at all these things, but what I usually buy in any situation is yardage. And I do feel like if you find a good place estate sales almost always have yardage in a lot of it.
A lot.
So kind of knowing what you're going to get, like what you're going to use, I should say, can help you figure out what you want to pick up because you can get too much. You can get crazy.
Yes, and I feel like I've gone a little crazy. I have an insane amount of vintage fabric, like tubs, like 2 tubs, which I feel like is a lot. Probably isn't compared to some people, but
Yeah.
for myself. But I have plans for all of it, as us quilters do.
That's what matters. It's going to be great. And one day, you're going to make a project with those and be really glad you picked
Yes, I want to make a gorgeous patchwork quilt with all of these beautiful fabrics that I've collected over the years.
That's right, because it's a patchwork revival, y'all.
Yes.
Think about, okay, any of us who have gone to antique stores, resale stores, thrift stores know there are quilts aplenty.
Yes.
Quilt tops, quilt blocks, finished quilts, hand quilted quilts, applique, patchwork. I love looking at them. It breaks my heart a little bit to look at them. Do you pick up quilts at these places?
It depends. Most of the time, I find quilt tops, unfinished quilts at the thrift, but it looks like they were just learning how to piece these pieces of fabric together. And so they're very wonky.
Yeah.
And I have been known to grab a quilt top or two when I was just learning about quilting. And I really can't even use these quilt tops. They're just sitting around in my stash. If it's a gorgeous quilt top, I will buy it.
Yeah.
Most of the time from an estate sale, a quilter's estate sale.
Like clearly, expertly pieced.
Yes.
Not that we're judging, but.
No, but you can just tell, though, if it's going to be something that you can quilt, if it's quiltable.
Right. Because we've all been in this situation, maybe not all of us, but where it's kind of like the beginner's paradox. It's like, yeah, awesome. Make what you want. Do what you want to do. But sometimes it's really, really hard to learn how to quilt on something that's going to be bubbly.
Exactly.
And you're just going to be disappointed.
Right. Those beginner quilt tops, they don't lay flat. A lot of these vintage quilt tops that I see, like I know I won't be able to press it out and pin it and get it ready for quilting. You can just tell by looking at it. So I would be weary of quilt tops when you're out thrifting.
Yeah, like be discerning. I suppose if you were one of these upcyclers that make hoodies or dresses or skirts, you could maybe do something like that.
Maybe, but sometimes I feel like they're
It's
just
too-
so crooked. You
Yeah.
couldn't even press it straight.
It's like,
Because I look for those quilt tops or those quilts that I can cut a block out or something,
Yeah.
if it's appropriate.
Yeah.
I don't believe in cutting all of the quilts I see.
I don't either. And I never have. I have an old quilt that, one of my mom's neighbors made for her when she was a child, and her and my aunt had matching ones on their little twin beds growing
Oh
up.
my gosh.
I know, it's sweet. It's little applique flowers, and a lot of them are like there's batting showing through, there's the appliques ripping up, and I'm like, man, this quilt deserves so much more than to just be sitting folded in the bottom of my thing. But I also know if I use it, it's going to really be damaged even more. And I don't think I have the skills to repair it.
Right.
Also, totally honest, I don't think I'm going to trust anyone else to repair it. So I don't know. I think in a situation like that, you could maybe make something that you were going to use, a pillow of a good portion of it.
Especially if there's parts of the quilt that you cannot mend.
Exactly.
Cut it at that point.
Like
Make
through
a
and
bag or
through
something,
holes
yes.
or missing bits and stuff. But yeah. But have you ever thought about the quilts that you make personally, like your quilts? What's going to happen to them? Do you know? Do you care?
I'm naive enough to think that my children are just going to love everything I make and hold on to them, right? Which is crazy. That's not true. But
No, I think it's true. Let us all just sit and believe that for just a second.
take a moment.
we're gonna label our quilts. They're gonna know everything about them, and they're gonna be like, "Oh man, my mom's hands touched this quilt. I'm keeping it forever."
At least for a few of them, right? Well, I do not mind anything that I've made. I would not care if it ended up in a thrift. My only hope is that it's labeled so that whoever comes across this handmade treasure, they can look up information about the person who made it.
I know.
That's my only hope. I don't mind if it ends up in the thrift. If I run into one of my items at the thrift, I would be so stoked. It would feel like a full circle moment to me.
Yeah, it would be a full circle. Would you leave it?
No, I would buy it. No, I am not leaving that. That is a treasure. That is a handmade treasure for myself.
Yeah,
I'm buying it for sure.
I would buy it, definitely. I really
cannot
would.
wait for that day, honestly.
Yeah.
I come across so many handmade gems at the thrift. I see the handmade labels on the clothing that people have repurposed.
What do you think is good information to include on a label?
Okay.
If you were imagining somebody in, let's say, 30 years picks up one of your quilts and there's a label on it, what do you want it to say?
I want it to have the name of the quilt. So Scout Quilt, the maker's name. I think the town. I like putting San Angelo, Texas on there.
I do too.
And the year.
Yeah.
Enough. The quilt I'm making for my daughter right now, I want it to say, of course, the name of the quilt and then like her name and for her 5th birthday.
Yeah.
Something like that.
An event, like a commemorative kind of
Yes.
note on there. I think that's important too.
I don't know if I'll probably put San Angelo, Texas in the year on that one too.
No, you should, especially for one of your children's events or life events or milestones, because that is a tangible thing. Instead of a scrapbook, oh yeah, here's this quilt. Oh yeah, remember? And she might show it to one of her children one day and be like, I was 5 when my mom made me this. Your grandma. That's so special.
Hopefully that quilt's not at the thrift and it's with her or her children or something.
I know.
But if it is at the thrift, it'll have all that information and it'll be fine.
Yeah, because we love quilts so much. We see them. We appreciate them. There's more people out there that do. So it's not like the end of the world.
It's not. And all of the quilts that I've thrifted are not labeled, usually, the ones from the thrift store. If I go to an estate sale, I find little notes attached to these unfinished quilt tops, like I was planning a black binding or something like that.
Oh, that's so cool.
I have a few of those at home. I should have brought those. I think you need to do a whole episode on thrifting.
Yeah, I know.
Revisit this one.
Yeah, we can revisit
bring
it.
all of the thrifted treasures.
You have a lot of them.
I have so many. And my thrifted quilt book collection is insane. I mean, I'm talking like, I don't even want to say a number. It's crazy, though.
Hundreds?
Close, maybe. I actually brought a book.
95.
I just love looking at different patterns, but I saw a pattern in there. And I was like, this is so Emily. I need to show it to her. It's in a book in there. So remind me to show you when I leave.
Okay, yes, I will for sure. The other thing that you have gotten really into is making bags.
Yes.
I love seeing your bags. I wanted to put some pictures of those in the show notes because they're super cute and really well done. The craftswomanship is really beautiful. And it's such a cool way for quilting and just sewing to kind of intersect. I think I love the quilted bags.
I love quilted bags too. And then there's just something so satisfying about a quick sew. Because quilting can get kind of time consuming. And
you can get really bogged down in these projects. That is for sure. It is not a quick win. It is not for everyone.
It is not for everyone. I struggle with it sometimes.
For sure. And sometimes feeling guilty that you haven't given something your attention for like 6 months. But like, let's be honest. It's going to get done. Like this beautiful quilt top that you brought here. That is a Plains and Pine quilt pattern. You did the block of the month, yeah?
I did join that, yes. And it was so fun. I joined the Plains and Pine block of the month for this great sky quilt.
Big Sky Star?
Is
this the Big Sky Star?
No, wait.
This is a different one. We'll figure it out and link it in the show notes.
It's been a while. I'm sorry. And so I joined the block of the month. And of course, we're posting our progress on Instagram. And it was a huge group, a huge community project, it felt like, because I had tons of people just reaching out and sending me messages and comments about where they were struggling or where they were at in the pattern. And so it really felt like I had a community when I was working on this quilt. I highly recommend joining a block of the month at least once.
Yeah.
So you can experience that.
See if you like it. I think very frequently as quilters, especially on these long projects, it's a lot of work.
This was a 6-month.
Mm-hmm. And you kind of do so much of it on your own. It's really easy to just hide in your sewing den. This is just my quilt. But it's so fun to have a community.
It is. And it was so fun watching everyone else finish their quilts. So many different variations. Everyone's style really comes through. Mm-hmm. This one's very bold. I like bright and bold. Like how I like my tattoos.
Yeah,
traditional. Bright and bold.
Yeah. Brie has really cool tattoos. You know what? Confession, I've always wanted a tattoo to commemorate something, and I've wanted to do something quilty or sewing related.
Oh my gosh, for your grandmother.
I know, which is kind of ironic because she would like roll in her grave knowing her granddaughters were tattooed. But I don't feel cool enough. Like I feel I feel like I don't know if I'm cool enough.
That is the craziest thing I've ever heard.
To be determined, but when do you ever thrift zippers, zipper pulls, hardware kind of stuff, or not so much?
I have thrifted metal zippers.
Metal specifically.
Metal specifically.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? You don't seem impressed.
They're kind of tough to sew with, especially if you're a newbie.
Yeah.
And I still feel like a newbie.
You've sewn more bags than I have. We're both newbies, but you are more expert for sure.
It feels dangerous sewing with a metal zipper.
Living on the edge.
And the zipper tape, the thrifted vintage zipper tape is a lot thinner than the nylon. I think that tape is like a number 3 or a number 4, whereas the nylon's a number 5.
Oh, okay.
In width.
So you're talking the width of it.
Yes. And so I kind of
gotcha.
struggle with metal zippers.
Yeah.
I used a metal zipper on one of my bags, though. So maybe I just don't know what I'm talking about.
Maybe it just depends.
But I have thrifted zippers, and I really don't use them as much as I should.
Yeah. Do you feel like the quality is still there?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Yes, you can totally use them. It's just user error on my part.
It's just kind of knowing you might have to adjust your practice or your maybe needle position or something. I don't know.
That. Yeah. I'm just not there yet.
Yeah. But do you agree with this? If you want to get better at something, the really best, I almost argue the only way is to just do it.
Yes.
Practice.
Make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
I feel like that's how I got to where I am today.
Me too. I quilt on my machine. I quilt on my domestic machine. I do free motion, lots of just basic straight lines and things.
She says basic, but her quilting is very impressive.
Well, because I'm a little bit foolish and I just haul off and I do what I want to do, and sometimes it works. But a lot of times I'll have a little fold on the back. I'll have a little pucker. To me, it's fine. I'm
It's
not
fine.
selling my quilts. I'm not commissioning work. These are just for me. They might end up in a thrift store someday.
You won't even see that pucker once the quilt is washed.
Yeah, and
It'll wash
I
out.
just don't care. I honestly do not care. If it's like really bad, like a straight up fold, then I'm like cussing up a storm alone in my sewing.
And hopefully you notice it before you finish the entire quilt so you can.
I have done it enough that after a significant section, I look at the back
Same.
because, man,
I've had that happen a few
that's pretty
times.
brutal when you just, yeah.
That happened to me when I was working on a quilt for the Casa Quilters.
Can you tell me about Casa
Okay, Casa
Quilters?
Quilters, they're an organization that makes quilts for children in foster care. And so, yeah, I was out throwing my trash one morning, and my next door neighbor was driving by. Had never met her. We've lived at this house for a few years already, and never met my next door neighbor. She stops and she's like, "Hey, I'm your neighbor. What's your name?" And I was like, "Oh, hi, I'm Bree." And she's like, "Oh, well, that's lovely. My husband is Father Bill. He is a father at this church downtown." And she named the church, and that's the church where my children go to Mom's Day Out. And so I'm telling her this. And so, we're connecting on that level. And then randomly I was like, "Do you sew or quilt or anything?" Because here I am lonely looking for another quilter.
Yeah, you're just a lonely girl in your sewing room.
I want quilty friends. I want friends who sew. So I asked her, "Do you sew?" And she's like, "Well, yes, I quilt." And I was like, "Well, I quilt too." And she was like, "Well, you need to come to the Casa Quilters. It's at the same church where your children are going. You're already familiar with everyone there."
That is
And
so
so
cool.
I showed up one morning very intimidated. I feel so intimidated going to anything quilty related. I was scared the first time I went to that quilt club meeting.
Oh,
to
me
meet you there.
too. I was terrified, but I was like, whatever. I may never see these people again.
Whatever.
That's how I tell myself. That's how I get through things. I'm like, I might just never see them again as we live in like a small town.
And then you run into them the next
And they're
day
your
at
next
HEB
door
or something.
neighbor.
They're my next door neighbor. Okay, so yeah, I live next to a quilter. I showed up to the Casa Quilters group. They all sew on vintage machines,
Oh man.
like Singer 201s.
They were like your people.
They were my people. And I'm talking about 2 rooms full of fabric. Like, I just like to go and look at all of the pretty fabric, and it smells like vintage fabric in there. It's so cool. All of the ladies are super nice. All they do is tell jokes.
Did they teach you? If you have issues with something, do you feel like you can ask them?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes, for sure. I met a woman there. Her name is Judy, and she reads stories to children at one of our local libraries. And so, of course, I take my children to story time with Judy, and Judy was at the quilt club meeting. She was one of the founders.
It's amazing.
It's such a small town here.
It really is, but also quilting is such a unifying thing. When you think about cultural, like ethnic backgrounds, you think about socioeconomic backgrounds, you think about age. I mean, how much can we stand to learn from women who have been alive for 50 years,
Yes.
60 years,
Yes.
70 years? They have so much
They really
wisdom
do.
to teach us about so much more than just fabric and sewing. And I love that they share.
Yes.
They're
It almost
so
feels like they're a
happy.
mentor of some sort.
100%.
It's nice to have these elders that are here to, guide us, it feels like.
I know, and to teach us how to guide other people.
Exactly.
Because as I have grown, I started this podcast because I finally was like, I have something to say and something to talk about, and so I'm just going to do it. And I feel like some of that just came from an appreciation of other people taking the time to do that with me. I would love to teach people to quilt,
Yes.
how to put fabric together. Like, I don't know, I think we're too caught up in this is my original piece and all these things when actually this is an art that's meant to connect us.
Exactly.
So,
And it feels like there's not much connecting going on. Whereas, back in the day, the lone quilter would piece her own quilt top alone at home, but then she would have a community bee, quilting bee, where most of the time it was family, but also neighbors later on would come over and they would all hand finish these quilts together.
that is how my grandmother quilted. She had a group at church and they hand quilted
I love
everyone's
that.
projects. So a lot of the quilts that we have from her were quilted by her and her community.
Oh, wow. We need to bring that back.
I think so,
That would
too.
be so fun.
I know. I think so.
I think so, too. We think so. I don't know.
I know. We think so. So obviously it is cool. Okay, so Bree, this is the wrap-up section of the podcast that I'm going to do. I've found this really cool book. I found it at an antique store in town. I actually found it at Concho Confetti.
Okay.
It was like,
I'm
actually,
familiar.
it's in here. Yeah, you've probably been there many a time. It was $10. It's called The Romance of the Patchwork Quilt. It was copyrighted in 1935 by Carrie Hall. And then, gosh, I think her name is Ruth Kretzinger, but the primary author is Carrie Hall. And it has an inscription, like the original owner.
Oh, I love
it's
that.
so sweet. But I have looked at it, and there are so many fun little sentences that she wrote, and she has little like poems and stuff. So this is one of my favorite things because when I read it, I'm like, this was in 1935, but here we are in 2024.
Oh, wow.
And I feel exactly the same way. So I want to hear your thoughts on this. Okay. So this is from the book, The Romance of the Patchwork Quilt. And she is talking about the quilt in the 20th century. So, early 1900s, 1930s. And what she says is this. The making of quilts in the home has become astonishingly popular, even to the extent of interfering with bridge schedules and attendance at the matinee. And I thought it's kind of hilarious because there are a lot of times when I don't really want to go out and do anything except stay at home and quilt. Do you feel that way?
Yes, all the time. Like, I need to go out and do something. Actually, can you just watch the kids for a bit so I can quilt?
I know. I love it. And I do think that, I was quilting when quilting wasn't cool. I'm talking in like college, high school.
Okay, but that's cool that you've been quilting that long.
Now it's very cool. But did you picture yourself being like this your whole life?
Absolutely not. If you would have told me that I would be quilting today, maybe like 7 years ago, I probably would have laughed in your face. Like, what? That is what? I don't even, how? Where would that even come from? But I'm glad I'm here today.
Me
quilting.
too. Do you think you will try to teach your kids to quilt?
Yes, they are so interested in sewing.
They are?
Yes, they are. Most of the time I sew at night after they go to bed.
Right.
But there are times where I will try to sneak in some sewing during the day. Mm-hmm. And I have an almost 3-year-old, and he every time wants to be either in a chair next to me watching the machine or on my lap watching the machine. And my almost 5-year-old, she's always like, Mom, please, I want to sew. Let me try.
Man, hallelujah.
And even my 12-year-old, after the kids go to bed, he's like, all right, pull out. I have a Singer featherweight.
Okay.
He's like, pull out that one. Teach me how to sew. It usually does not go well because we're both, neither one of us are patient enough to work with each other.
Like, are y'all alike?
Probably.
So you can't get along?
But he's a 12-year-old boy who just like wants to get something done. He doesn't have the patience or the focus to actually, okay, you need to go slow.
Yeah.
Pay attention to what you're doing. He's like, I want to go fast. And just that.
Yeah.
I need to work on that more with him.
Okay. Is there anything we haven't talked about that we need to talk about?
I think we covered everything.
I hope that we have shared about your quilting legacy because my firm belief is that whether we are intentionally doing it or not, we are leaving behind a legacy. And it's more than just sewing. It's more than just the quilts, but this is how some people are going to remember us.
Yes.
And it's special.
It is special. I love sewing for my children, and I know that they love receiving these handmade gifts from me. And I'm naive enough, again, to think that they're just going to want to sew too.
They will. Bree, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for celebrating the generational connection that quilts offer us. Bye. Well, that's it for this episode of Patchwork Revival. I loved having you here with me talking all things quilty. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and leave a rave review. If you don't really have a lot of nice things to say, it's okay to say nothing. Also, be sure to jump down to the show notes to find links for this episode, as well as the link to my shop where you can enjoy 15% off as a podcast listener with code REVIVAL. Remember that the Patchwork Revival podcast is here to celebrate the connection made in the quilts we love. I'll see you next time.